threshold fact that everybody needs to agree to is that Greenland is important for America's national security. He raised it in his first term, and he was met with derision, mockery, laughter. The Europeans and Denmark have done nothing to strengthen Greenland's defenses.
Donald Trump will address world leaders at Davos today, having spent the last few weeks angering many of them with his comments on Greenland, tariffs, and the Chagos Islands and elsewhere. European leaders have accused the US president of unraveling the global order, but Trump says now he will work something out with Nato on the issue of Greenland. Well, Joe Grogan was Trump's policy chief during his first term, and he's in the studio with me now. Hello, Joe.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much for being here. Look, do you think Donald Trump can work something out with NATO over Greenland? Does he want to work something out?
Oh, yeah, he definitely wants to work something out. I think the threshold fact that everybody needs to agree to is that Greenland is important for America's national security. He raised it in his first term, and he was met with derision, mockery, laughter. The Europeans and Denmark have done nothing to strengthen Greenland's defenses. They've done nothing to approach the United States. When Biden was president, they didn't try and reach some type of agreement. And I think this is part of a pattern of Donald Trump making statements about, say, dependence on Russian oil in his first term and being mocked and then growing angry and the rhetoric rising. I'm glad that there does seem to be some tempering right now of some of the language, and I hope that and expect that some type of agreement will be reached.
So, this is well-traveled ground, but the suspicion is with Trump, among many people, that while Greenland is of course important for Atlantic security and American security, America has all the mechanisms it requires to fill Greenland with as much military hardware as it wishes already. The laws are already in place. Really, what Donald Trump wants here is to expand the territory of the United States, and anything less than that he would see as a failure and a climb down. Is that the wrong way of looking at it?
I don't know that it's necessarily an inappropriate way of looking at it. To be fair, I do think he doesn't necessarily trust the Europeans to keep those agreements over the long term and with future U.S. presidents. He looks at, say, you mentioned the Chagos Islands and the Chinese embassy here in London and those issues, which he would view as, say, suicidal. Just as growing dependent on Russian oil, he viewed as suicidal. Some of the immigration policies that Europe is producing, suicidal. Net zero, suicidal. So why would he expect Europe to necessarily honor an agreement to defend Greenland and keep American troops there, or to commit resources to defend it in the case that China or Russia were to make a move on Greenland?
Sure, but just to be absolutely clear, you really do think his driving motive here is one of security rather than the somewhat perhaps egotistical desire to be the man who expanded America?
I think he is absolutely focused on protecting the United States and leaving America stronger than when he arrived. It is clear that he views Greenland, as he has expressly said, as important to American security. There is precedent for us buying property from the Danish before. We bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark. There's no reason why the Danish should have responded in the way they did with such derision. And frankly, they should have treated the request, the statement, with respect in his first term and engaged in constructive dialogue. And I hope that they will now.
What sort of tone do you expect Donald Trump to strike today in Davos? Because, will he lean into the extent to which he is upset and angered people? And does he enjoy that? Or do you think now's the point where he tries to be a bit more conciliatory?
Well, I can't predict. I can tell you, having Macron go out there and lecture the United States about colonialism is about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. It's laughable, especially with him wearing like Hosni Mubarak sunglasses out there. The picture was rich.
I think the man's got conjunctivitis, in fairness to him. But
well, he could have done a radio interview, yeah. But he also could have been, more importantly, he could have been quiet and not tried to lecture the United States about colonialism. We don't need to hear, President Trump doesn't need to hear that from a French president. So some of the rhetoric, clearly, Danish members of parliament using vulgarities about the president doesn't help things very much. I'd also say, this performance of sending a few troops to Greenland on the part of NATO members was stupid and should not have been engaged upon. They should have immediately tried to engage in constructive dialogue and ramp down the rhetoric. Unfortunately, they've decided to, for whatever reason, throw gasoline on the fire. And this is part of a pattern from the first term. I said this didn't start in a vacuum. President Trump has put these things out there, as I mentioned, about dependence on Russian oil, but spending more money on national defense, had the Europeans blow him off or mock him, and then turned around and said, maybe you were right about this. We are finally having a discussion about how important Greenland is to U.S. national security, especially in the context of a rising China and a very aggressive Russia.
How is he, as a man, when is he happiest? Is he happy having a fight when he gets pushed back and he gets to push back as well, and trading insults, trading barbs? Or does he like it when people just buckle and he gets his way? Or does he find that perhaps a bit unsatisfying? Does he like the fight just as a person?
Well, I don't think he's afraid of a fight, to be honest with you. I don't know that he would, if you were to ask him that question, I don't say, yeah, I really would rather that the Danish just capitulated and signed it over. I think the threshold point is the Danish should have recognized that it was, one, important for American national security, and Donald Trump had a point, and two, engaged in constructive dialogue about how to alleviate the president's concern and perhaps even sell it, leave it to a referendum of the people of Denmark, the people of Greenland, allow the president to put a offer on the table for those residents as well. And I think he's brought up the Chagos Islands. Those residents are not getting a opportunity to vote on whether or not Britain sacrifices them to the Chinese. So I think the president's point here is a valid one. He has once again moved the paradigm of discussion to a more reasonable place than it was before, and I'm hopeful that an agreement can be reached in Davos.
On the Chagos Islands, why do you think his position has changed? Because he was very much in favour of this deal. It probably wouldn't have gone ahead without his approval in the first place. And now he's against it. Is it possible that he just sort of wasn't paying attention the first time it crossed his desk?
I don't know exactly why his focus on it. His explanation is that some of the terms of the deal has changed from his original understanding. Well, he claims that it has. Maybe it was represented in a way that's different. I do think that a lot of people were asleep at the switch and there was not a lot of rhetoric. Frankly, I live here in the UK. I did not know about the strategic interests and a lot of the background about Chagos until I moved here and started to have conversations with people who understood the area and had military experience with the UK military, and were very concerned about it. So why it was ever put on the table in the first instance is a question that should be asked.
Within the United States, well, I mean, outside the United States, people think of foreign policy first and foremost when they think of Donald Trump. It's why many people were wary of the idea of him becoming president. It's why he sort of generates such huge controversy here. Within the United States, how much do people, I mean, does foreign policy dominate the US in the same way? Or are people not really thinking about that?
Well, I mean, it'd be no secret, I think, if you guys are on the tip of the spear on a lot of issues. So, you're much closer to Russia. You're much closer to a lot of, and you have a much deeper experience with wars on your own territory than the United States does, and many more wars. So it isn't necessarily top of mind all the time. I do think Americans, when it does come into America's worldview, they can be very patriotic, pro the United States, and given time, they will understand America's strategic interests. I think, again, with Greenland, there were not a lot of Americans focused on the importance strategically of Greenland until President Trump began to discuss it, and now it is cutting through and people understand how important it is. The same is true, for instance, in Venezuela. People did not understand the extent of the drug trafficking and the extent of Russian and Chinese involvement in Venezuela until President Trump began to discuss it.
Within the United States, one of the most controversial things, I mean, it looks from here anyway, that he has done is introducing ICE, the Border Enforcement Agency, and it's controversial, especially after the shooting of a woman in Minneapolis. Is that the sort of thing he wanted to do in his first term?
Well, I don't think he's looking for unrest like that. I think he clearly does, though, want to deport criminal aliens from the United States. You do need to recognize the fact, though, that we had 4 years of President Biden lecturing the American people and the media repeating his untruth that you needed legislation to secure the southern border with Mexico.
But the idea of like sort of creating that force, putting that force into American cities, do you think he would have done? Do you think he's been emboldened in his second term, and he would have liked to do stuff like that in his first term?
Well, the situation is far more grave than it was in his first term. I mean, we had a massive influx of illegal aliens and criminal illegal aliens into the United States. If you pay attention, there are incidents highlighted on social media and on conservative media just about daily of an American citizen getting killed by an illegal alien in a criminal act or a drunk driving accident or something like that. That doesn't get reported in the mainstream media, but the situation is far more grave, and I think his team views it as more aggressive measures are needed than would have been needed in the first term. Remember, too, he pursued legislation from the Democratic Congress and didn't get it on comprehensive immigration reform.
We're getting quite a lot of angry texts about your position on Chagos and your interpretation of what's happening in Greenland, indeed your interpretation of the Chagos deal as well. I'm interested in whether as an American, who you say you now live in Britain, whether you felt a changing mood towards Americans in Britain over the last few months.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think there's been, you talk to some people. There are certain people that look very forward to Trump arriving because of their disaffection with the labor government here, the moribund economy, the what they view as UK adrift. So we're hoping that Trump would provide a little oomph to reform movements here in the United States. Here in the UK. So I think it's mixed. You talk to cab drivers, you get a different view than you would from the elite.
Look, Joe Grogan, great to speak to you. I'm sorry we didn't have the time to cover more, but great to have you here in the studio. I hope you'll come back. That's Joe Grogan, former policy chief to Donald Trump. Thanks very much indeed for being with us.